the historical accident that created Christianity. What if I told you that the world's largest religion, Christianity, exists today not because of divine intervention, but because of a calculated political move by a Roman emperor who may have never actually converted at all? What if the foundation of Christian civilization as we know it was built on one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns? Picture this. It's the year 312 CE, and a Roman general named Constantine is marching toward what will become the most consequential battle in Western history. He commands a ragtag army of 40,000 men, vastly outnumbered by his rival's forces of 100,000. The odds are stacked against him. The empire is crumbling, and everything depends on the next 24 hours. But Constantine has a plan, and it doesn't involve the gods his ancestors worshipped for centuries. Instead, he's about to make a bet on a tiny, persecuted religious minority that represents less than 5% of the empire's population. 3 million Christians scattered across an empire of 60 million people. It sounds insane, right? Why would anyone choose the losing side? But here's the thing. Constantine understood something that would change the course of human history forever. This isn't just another story about religious conversion. This is the story of how one man's political genius created the world we live in today, and how the greatest accident in history wasn't really an accident at all, because what I'm about to show you will completely reshape how you understand not just Christianity, but the very foundations of Western civilization itself. By the time we're done here, you'll see how a desperate emperor's survival strategy became the blueprint for controlling hearts and minds for the next 2,000 years. And trust me, once you see the evidence, you can never unsee it. But first, let's go back to where it all began. Because the Roman Empire of 312 CE was nothing like the mighty civilization you might imagine. This wasn't the Rome of gladiators and glory. This was a dying empire, torn apart by civil war, economic collapse, and religious chaos. For nearly 50 years, the crisis of the 3rd century had devastated the known world. Plague, famine, hyperinflation, and barbarian invasions had reduced the once mighty empire to a shadow of its former self. Picture the chaos. In just 50 years, 50 different emperors had claimed the throne. Most of them died violent deaths within months of taking power. The Roman military had essentially become kingmakers, elevating and deposing rulers based on whoever could pay them the most. The economy had collapsed so completely that people had stopped using Roman coins and returned to bartering. The very idea of Roman authority had become a joke. And in the middle of this chaos, something unprecedented was happening. A new religion was spreading like wildfire through the urban centers of the empire. Christianity had started as a small Jewish sect in a backwater province called Palestine. But by 300 CE, it had grown into something the Roman authorities couldn't ignore anymore. 3 million believers scattered across the empire's major cities, creating networks of loyalty that transcended traditional Roman boundaries. Here's what made Christianity different from every other religion in the Roman world. It demanded exclusive loyalty. Romans had always been religiously tolerant, happy to add new gods to their pantheon, as long as you also honored the traditional Roman deities and the divine emperor. But Christians refused to compromise. They wouldn't burn incense to the emperor's statue. They wouldn't participate in traditional festivals. And they claimed their God was the only true God. This made them, in Roman eyes, atheists and traitors. For nearly 3 centuries, Roman authorities had tried everything to deal with the Christian problem. They'd ignored them, persecuted them, executed their leaders, and even launched empire-wide campaigns to wipe them out completely. The most brutal persecution had happened just a few years earlier under Emperor Diocletian, who had ordered the destruction of Christian scriptures, the demolition of churches, and the execution of anyone who refused to sacrifice to Roman gods. But here's the incredible thing. None of it worked. Every persecution just made Christianity stronger. Every martyrdom created 10 new converts. The more Rome tried to crush this religion, the more it spread. By 312 CE, Christians could be found in every major city, in every social class, and even in the imperial bureaucracy itself. They had created a parallel society within the Roman Empire, complete with their own leadership structure, their own communication networks, and their own sources of funding. Now, most Roman generals looking at this situation would have seen Christianity as a threat to be eliminated. But Constantine wasn't most Roman generals. He was the son of a usurper who had clawed his way to power in the chaos of the Tetrarchy, a system where 4 emperors supposedly shared control of the empire. Constantine had grown up watching his father navigate the deadly politics of late imperial Rome, where survival depended on reading people, building coalitions, and making the right alliances at exactly the right moment. And as Constantine marched toward Rome in 312, preparing to face his rival Maxentius at a place called the Milvian Bridge, he was doing calculations that had nothing to do with divine visions or religious conversion. He was looking at the demographics of power in a failing empire, and he was seeing an opportunity that no one else had recognized. Think about it from Constantine's perspective. The traditional Roman religious system was tied to the old aristocratic families, the ones who had benefited from centuries of imperial expansion and exploitation. These were the people who had the most to lose if the empire continued to collapse, and they were also the people least likely to support a relative outsider like Constantine. Meanwhile, Christianity appealed primarily to urban merchants, skilled craftsmen, minor officials, and educated freedmen. Exactly the kinds of people who kept the empire's economy and bureaucracy functioning on a day-to-day basis. Even more importantly, Christians had something that traditional Roman religion completely lacked: organizational unity. Roman religion was a collection of local cults and family traditions held together by imperial ceremony and civic duty. When the empire was strong, this system worked perfectly. But when imperial authority collapsed, as it had during the crisis of the 3rd century, Roman religion collapsed with it. Christianity, on the other hand, had developed its own leadership structure that operated independently of imperial authority. Christian bishops could coordinate across vast distances. Christian communities could support each other during times of crisis, and Christian networks could function even when the imperial government couldn't. Constantine realized that if he could somehow harness this organizational power for his own purposes, he could solve the empire's fundamental problem: the lack of a unifying ideology that could hold together diverse populations across vast territories. Traditional Roman religion had worked when Rome was conquering new territories and imposing its will through military force. But it was utterly useless for governing a diverse, complex civilization during times of crisis. Christianity offered something completely different: a universal message that could appeal to people regardless of their ethnic background, social status, or local traditions. It promised justice for the oppressed, meaning for the suffering, and hope for the future. Most importantly, it offered a clear hierarchy of authority that could complement rather than compete with imperial power, if handled correctly. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because what Constantine did next wasn't a sudden religious conversion driven by divine revelation. It was a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign that would make modern political consultants weep with envy. The famous vision of the cross, the dream of Christ, the miraculous victory at Milvian Bridge, all of these elements were crafted and refined over time to create a narrative that would serve Constantine's political purposes for decades to come. Let's examine what actually happened at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, because the real story is far more fascinating than the legend. Maxentius had positioned his army on the far side of the Tiber River, with the ancient stone bridge as the only crossing point. It was a strong defensive position, and Maxentius had numerical superiority. Any competent military historian will tell you that Constantine should have lost this battle. But Constantine had spent months preparing for this moment, and his preparations had nothing to do with divine visions. He had been building a coalition of support that included not just his own troops, but sympathetic elements within Rome itself. He had been sending messages to Christian communities throughout the empire, promising an end to persecution and hinting at official recognition. He had been cultivating relationships with Christian bishops and wealthy Christian merchants who could provide both intelligence and financial support. Most crucially, Constantine had been studying his enemy. Maxentius was popular with the traditional Roman aristocracy, but he had made enemies among the urban populations that kept Rome functioning. His tax policies had alienated merchants. His building projects had displaced thousands of ordinary Romans, and his reliance on foreign mercenaries had created resentment among Roman citizens, who felt their own interests were being ignored. Constantine's genius lay in recognizing that this wasn't just a military contest, it was a competition for legitimacy. Whoever won at Milvian Bridge would need to govern not just Rome, but an entire empire filled with diverse populations who had their own ideas about authority and justice. Military victory was just the first step. The real challenge would be creating a system of government that could hold everything together. And that's where the Christian angle becomes so brilliant, because Constantine wasn't just adopting a new religion. He was positioning himself as the protector of an oppressed minority, while simultaneously creating a new framework for imperial authority that could survive the collapse of traditional Roman institutions. The Chi symbol that Constantine supposedly saw in his vision. It wasn't just a Christian symbol. It was also remarkably similar to existing Roman military emblems and solar imagery that his troops would have recognized. The promise of victory in this sign. It gave his soldiers confidence while creating a narrative that could be interpreted differently by different audiences. Christians could see it as divine validation of their faith, while traditional Romans could interpret it as the favor of Sol Invictus, the sun god that Constantine's family had long supported. This is what made Constantine's strategy so effective. It was deliberately ambiguous. Everyone could see what they wanted to see, while Constantine retained maximum flexibility to adapt his message as circumstances changed. But the real proof that this was a calculated political move, rather than a genuine religious conversion, lies in what Constantine did after his victory at Milvian Bridge. And this is where the story gets absolutely fascinating, because Constantine's behavior in the years following his supposed conversion reveals a level of strategic thinking that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. First, let's talk about timing. If Constantine had truly experienced a life-changing religious revelation in 312, you'd expect to see immediate and dramatic changes in his policies, right? But that's not what happened. Instead, Constantine spent the next 13 years playing both sides, maintaining his relationship with traditional Roman religion, while gradually building his Christian coalition. He kept his title as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman religion. He continued to honor traditional Roman gods in his official communications with Western provinces. His coins still featured pagan imagery, and he continued to fund traditional Roman temples. This isn't the behavior of someone who's had a genuine religious awakening. This is the behavior of someone who's managing a delicate political transition. Constantine understood that moving too fast would alienate the traditional Roman elite, while moving too slowly would lose the Christian communities he was trying to court. So he walked a tightrope, giving each group just enough of what they wanted to keep them loyal, while avoiding commitments that would force him to choose sides prematurely. The Edict of Milan in 313 is a perfect example of this strategy. Most people think of it as Constantine legalizing Christianity, but read the actual text, and you'll see something much more sophisticated. The edict didn't just legalize Christianity, it legalized all religions. It was presented as a return to traditional Roman religious tolerance, not as a victory for Christianity specifically. Constantine was positioning himself not as a Christian emperor, but as a reasonable ruler who wanted to end religious persecution and restore stability to the empire. But here's where it gets really clever. While the edict applied to all religions equally in theory, in practice it gave Christians a massive advantage. Why? Because Christians were the only religious group that had been systematically persecuted empire-wide. Jews had faced local persecution, but they already had legal protections in most provinces. Traditional Roman religious practices had never been illegal. Mystery cults operated freely as long as they didn't challenge imperial authority. Christianity was the only religion that truly benefited from this new policy of universal tolerance, and Constantine made sure everyone knew who to thank for this change. Christian bishops suddenly found themselves with access to the imperial court. Christian communities received financial support for rebuilding churches that had been destroyed during persecutions. Christian leaders were invited to participate in imperial ceremonies and given roles in local government. Within just a few years, being a Christian went from being a potential death sentence to being a path to social advancement. But Constantine's masterstroke was still to come, and it involved one of the most brilliant pieces of political theatre in human history. I'm talking about the Council of Nicaea in 325, an event that most people think was about theology, but was actually about something far more important: the creation of a new system of imperial control that could survive the collapse of traditional Roman institutions. Here's the context you need to understand. By 324, Constantine had finally defeated his last rival, Licinius, and become sole emperor of a reunited Roman Empire. But unity on paper didn't mean unity in reality. The empire was still racked by economic problems, barbarian pressures, and social tensions that had been building for generations. Constantine needed something more powerful than military force to hold everything together. He needed an ideology that could inspire loyalty across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries. Traditional Roman religion couldn't do this anymore. It was too closely associated with the old aristocratic families and the failed policies of previous emperors. The imperial cult was a joke after decades of rapidly changing rulers. Philosophical schools like Stoicism appealed only to educated elites. Mystery religions were too exclusive and localized. None of these options could provide the kind of empire-wide unity that Constantine desperately needed. But Christianity had potential, if it could be properly managed. The problem was that Christians were fighting among themselves over theological questions that seemed to have no practical importance to imperial governance. The biggest controversy involved a priest named Arius, who taught that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father. This might sound like an obscure theological debate, but it was tearing Christian communities apart across the Eastern Empire, creating exactly the kind of division that Constantine was trying to eliminate. So, Constantine did something unprecedented. He called a council of Christian bishops from across the entire empire, paid their travel expenses, provided them with luxury accommodations, and essentially told them to figure out their differences or else. This wasn't a religious gathering. It was a political convention designed to create a unified Christian organization that could serve imperial purposes. The Council of Nicaea was a masterclass in political manipulation, disguised as theological debate. Constantine didn't just host the council, he actively managed it. He opened the proceedings with a speech emphasizing the need for unity and peace. He sat in on the debates, asking questions and steering discussions toward conclusions that served his political interests. When the bishops couldn't reach consensus on their own, Constantine pushed them toward compromise positions that prioritized institutional unity over theological purity. The famous Nicene Creed that emerged from this council wasn't just a statement of Christian belief, it was a loyalty oath designed to identify and exclude anyone who might challenge the new church-state partnership that Constantine was creating. Bishops who signed the creed received imperial support, access to government resources, and protection from their enemies. Bishops who refused, like Arius and his supporters, were exiled and had their writings burned. But here's the most telling detail. Constantine himself wasn't even baptized at the time he was making these theological decisions for the Christian Church. He wouldn't be baptized until he was literally on his deathbed in 337, 25 years after his supposed conversion. And even then, he was baptized by an Arian bishop, one of the very people whose theology had been condemned at Nicaea. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about Constantine's true relationship with Christianity, I don't know what does. The financial incentives Constantine used to secure compliance at Nicaea reveal the political nature of the entire enterprise. Bishops who supported the imperial position found themselves with access to government funding for their churches, free travel privileges, legal authority as magistrates, and grain distributions for their communities. This wasn't theological persuasion, it was a sophisticated system of rewards and punishments designed to align Christian leadership with imperial interests. And it worked brilliantly. Within a generation, Christianity went from being a persecuted minority to being the dominant religion of the empire. But this wasn't the same Christianity that had spread through the urban centers during the first 3 centuries. This was something new. An imperial religion designed to serve the needs of the state rather than challenge them. The transformation was so dramatic that it created immediate problems. Genuine Christian communities found themselves flooded with new converts who were motivated more by political advancement than religious conviction. Monks and hermits fled to the desert to escape what they saw as the corruption of their faith by imperial politics. Alternative Christian groups like the Donatists in North Africa refused to accept bishops who had collaborated with the imperial system and were subsequently her persecuted ascetics. Meanwhile, Constantine was busy creating the institutional framework that would define European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The partnership between church and state that he established at Nicaea became the template for medieval kingship, where rulers claimed divine authority, while religious leaders provided legitimacy for political power. The concept of religious orthodoxy, enforced by imperial decree, became the foundation for centuries of religious warfare and persecution. The idea that theological truth could be determined by political authority rather than spiritual discernment fundamentally altered the nature of Christianity itself. But perhaps most importantly, Constantine had solved the Roman Empire's fundamental problem: how to govern a diverse, complex civilization without relying solely on military force. By creating a unified Christian church that could operate across ethnic and linguistic boundaries while remaining subordinate to imperial authority, he had developed a system of social control that could survive even the collapse of central government. This is why Constantine's actions had such lasting impact. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, the Christian church that Constantine had created continued to function, preserving not just religious traditions, systems, educational but also legal institutions, and administrative structures that kept European civilization from completely disintegrating. The evidence for this interpretation isn't hidden in obscure academic journals or conspiracy theories. It's right there in the historical record if you know how to read it. The timing of Constantine's policies, the financial incentives he offered to Christian leaders, the institutional structures he created, the way he managed theological debates to serve political purposes, all of this points to a level of strategic planning that's completely inconsistent with a sudden religious conversion. And here's where the story gets even more revealing. Because Constantine's personal behavior throughout this entire period shows a man who understood exactly what he was doing. While he was publicly positioning himself as Christianity's great protector, he was privately maintaining all the privileges and practices of traditional Roman imperial power. Take his family life, for example. In 326, just 1 year after the Council of Nicaea, where he had supposedly established Christian orthodoxy, Constantine ordered the execution of his own son Crispus and his wife Fausta. The official reasons were never made clear, but most historians believe it involved some kind of palace intrigue or succession dispute. Now, if Constantine had genuinely converted to Christianity and believed in its moral teachings, how do you explain him murdering his own family members? This isn't the behavior of a man guided by Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption. This is the behavior of a Roman emperor doing whatever it takes to maintain power. But Constantine was smart enough to manage the optics. Christian bishops were encouraged to focus on theological debates and administrative matters while staying out of imperial family business. The church-state partnership that Constantine was building depended on clear boundaries. The church could have authority over spiritual matters as long as it didn't interfere with the emperor's political decisions. This division of labor would become one of the defining features of European civilization, but it started as Constantine's solution to a very practical problem. Even more telling is how Constantine handled the city that would bear his name. When he decided to build a new capital at Constantinople in 330, he filled it with Christian churches and Christian symbolism, right? Wrong. Constantine's new city was a carefully balanced mixture of Christian and pagan elements, designed to appeal to every major constituency in the empire. Yes, there were Christian churches, but there were also temples to traditional Roman gods, monuments celebrating pagan victories, and artistic programs that deliberately blended Christian and classical themes. The famous statue of Constantine that stood at the center of the city is a perfect example of this strategy. From a distance, it looked like a traditional Roman imperial statue, complete with a crown of solar rays that could be interpreted as honoring Sol Invictus. But up close, Christian observers could see that the rays formed a halo, and the pose echoed artistic representations of Christ. Once again, Constantine was creating symbols that could be read differently by different audiences, while maintaining his own flexibility. This kind of sophisticated image management reveals a level of political calculation that most people don't associate with religious conversion. Constantine wasn't just adopting Christianity, he was rebranding the entire Roman Empire using Christian imagery while maintaining the substance of imperial power. It was one of history's most successful marketing campaigns, and it worked because Constantine understood something that most rulers miss. People don't just want power to serve their interests. They want power to reflect their values and aspirations. But the real proof of Constantine's political genius lies in what happened after his death in 337. If his conversion had been genuine, you'd expect his successors to continue his Christian policies naturally and smoothly. Instead, what you see is immediate chaos as different factions try to interpret and control Constantine's legacy. His 3 sons divided the empire among themselves and immediately started fighting over both political territory and religious authority. The Christian church that Constantine had carefully unified at Nicaea split apart into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true interpretation of his policies. This chaos wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of Constantine's strategy. He had created a system that depended entirely on his personal authority to hold together competing interests and conflicting ideologies. He had never actually resolved the fundamental tensions between Christian and Roman values. He had simply managed them through a combination of political skill and institutional manipulation. When that personal authority disappeared, all the underlying conflicts immediately resurfaced. The most revealing episode came just a few years after Constantine's death, when his nephew Julian became emperor and tried to reverse the entire Christian project. Julian, who had been raised as a Christian in Constantine's court, understood better than anyone how the whole system actually worked. He had seen the financial incentives, the political appointments, the theological compromises, and the institutional manipulation that had created Constantine's Christian empire. And he correctly identified that if you removed the imperial support, the whole structure would collapse. Julian's attempt to restore traditional Roman religion failed, but not for the reasons most people think. It wasn't because Christianity had become too deeply rooted in people's hearts and minds. It failed because Constantine had created institutional structures that were too valuable to abandon, even if people didn't really believe in the underlying ideology. Christian bishops had become too important as local administrators. Christian networks had become too useful for communication and coordination. And Christian institutions had become too integrated into the empire's economic and social systems. This is the ultimate proof that Constantine's project was political rather than religious from the beginning. The Christianity that survived Julian's persecution wasn't the Christianity of the early martyrs or the Desert Fathers. It was an institutional Christianity that could function regardless of the personal beliefs of its leaders or members. It was a Christianity designed to serve the state rather than challenge it, and it succeeded precisely because it had been engineered for that purpose. The long-term consequences of Constantine's strategy extended far beyond the Roman Empire itself. When barbarian kingdoms began carving up the Western Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries, they didn't destroy the Christian institutions that Constantine had created. Instead, they adopted them, because these institutions provided exactly what the barbarian kings needed: a way to govern Roman populations using Roman administrative methods while claiming divine legitimacy for their rule. The Frankish kings who would eventually become the Holy Roman Emperors, the Visigothic rulers of Spain, the Ostrogothic kings of Italy, all of them used the Constantinian model of church-state partnership to legitimize their authority over populations that had no reason to accept barbarian rule. They could claim to be protecting Christianity while using Christian institutions to collect taxes, enforce laws, and maintain social order. This is how Constantine's political innovation became the foundation of medieval European civilization. The feudal system, the concept of divine right monarchy, the institutional partnership between religious and secular authority, the idea that political legitimacy comes from God rather than popular consent. All of these defining features of European history trace back to the system that Constantine created in the 4th century. But here's what makes the story even more fascinating. Constantine's strategy was so successful that it eventually became impossible to separate the political and religious elements. By the time of Charlemagne in the 8th century, being a Christian ruler and being a legitimate ruler had become essentially the same thing in European consciousness. The church-state partnership that Constantine had created as a practical political solution had evolved into a fundamental assumption about how society should be organized. This transformation had profound implications for how Christianity itself developed. The religion that emerged from Constantine's system was fundamentally different from the Christianity that had existed before him. It was more hierarchical, more focused on institutional authority, more concerned with maintaining social order, and more willing to use violence to enforce orthodoxy. These weren't corruptions of original Christianity. They were logical consequences of the political project that Constantine had initiated. The evidence for this transformation can be seen in how Christian theology changed during the 4th and 5th centuries. Before Constantine, Christian thinkers like Origen and Tertullian had developed sophisticated critiques of imperial power and had argued that Christianity offered an alternative to worldly authority structures. After Constantine, Christian theologians like Augustine and John Chrysostom were much more concerned with explaining how Christians could serve God while also serving the emperor. This shift wasn't accidental. It was the result of institutional pressures created by Constantine's system. Christian leaders who wanted to maintain their positions and influence had to find ways to reconcile Christian teachings with the demands of imperial governance. Over time, this theological accommodation became so natural that most people forgot there had ever been an alternative. The Council of Nicaea was crucial to this transformation, but not for the reasons most people think. Yes, it established the doctrine of the Trinity and condemned Arianism, but its more important function was to create a precedent for imperial control over Christian doctrine. Constantine had demonstrated that emperors could convene church councils, influence theological debates, and enforce doctrinal decisions through political pressure. This precedent would be used by his successors for centuries to shape Christianity according to their political needs. The financial mechanisms that Constantine used to control Christian leadership also became permanently embedded in the system. The practice of imperial funding for churches, the appointment of bishops to government positions, the use of religious authority to enforce secular law, all of these innovations became standard features of European governance that persisted long after the Roman Empire itself had disappeared. But perhaps the most important long-term consequence was how Constantine's system changed the relationship between religious belief and political power. Before Constantine, being a Christian meant accepting a set of beliefs and practices that often put you in conflict with worldly authority. After Constantine, being a Christian became a way of accessing worldly authority. This reversal fundamentally altered what Christianity meant as a social and cultural force. The implications of this change can be seen throughout European history. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, all of these events were made possible by the institutional structures that Constantine had created. When religious and political authority became intertwined, religious differences automatically became political threats that had to be eliminated through force. Even the Protestant Reformation can be understood as a reaction against the Constantinian system. When Martin Luther challenged papal authority, he was essentially arguing that Constantine's merger of church and state had corrupted Christianity and needed to be reversed. But ironically, the Protestant princes who supported Luther used the same Constantinian logic to justify their rebellion. They claimed divine authority for their political actions and used religious reform to strengthen their secular power. The American separation of church and state represents one of the first serious attempts to undo Constantine's legacy, but even that was incomplete. American civil religion, with its appeals to divine providence and its assumption that political institutions serve moral purposes, still reflects the basic Constantinian premise that legitimate government requires religious legitimacy. Understanding Constantine's true motivations helps explain why Christianity spread so rapidly after the 4th century, but it also raises disturbing questions about what that spread actually meant. If the growth of Christianity was driven primarily by political advantages rather than spiritual conviction, what does that say about the nature of religious belief itself? If the institutional structures that preserved Christian civilization through the collapse of Rome were created for political rather than spiritual purposes, what does that mean for how we understand the relationship between faith and culture? These aren't just academic questions. They go to the heart of how we understand the role of religion in human society and the relationship between spiritual truth and political power. Constantine's story suggests that these relationships are far more complex and morally ambiguous than most people want to admit. The evidence shows that Constantine was neither a genuine convert nor a cynical manipulator, but something more interesting: a brilliant political strategist who understood that successful governance requires both institutional effectiveness and ideological legitimacy. He saw that Christianity could provide both, if it could be properly managed and controlled. His success lay in creating a system that served political purposes while allowing people to believe they were serving spiritual purposes. This is what makes Constantine's story so relevant today. We live in a world where political and religious authorities still compete for legitimacy, where institutional power still depends on ideological support, and where the boundaries between spiritual and secular authority remain contested and unclear. Understanding how Constantine navigated these challenges 2,000 years ago provides insights into how similar challenges might be addressed today. The accident that created Christianity wasn't really an accident at all. It was the result of one man's recognition that the collision between a failing political system and a rising religious movement created an opportunity to build something entirely new. Constantine's genius lay in seeing that opportunity and having the skill to exploit it without destroying either the political or religious elements that made it possible. But the real question isn't whether Constantine was sincere in his conversion. The real question is whether it matters. The system he created survived for over 1,000 years and shaped the fundamental assumptions about government, society, and human purpose that still influence us today. Whether he believed in Christianity or simply used it for political purposes, the results were the same. The transformation of both Christianity and Western civilization in ways that neither Christians nor Romans could have anticipated.
Wow.
This is the deeper lesson of Constantine's story. That historical change often happens not because of grand ideological movements or spiritual awakening, but because of practical political decisions made by individuals who are trying to solve immediate problems. The long-term consequences of those decisions can be far more significant than anyone involved ever imagined, and they can create realities that persist long after the original motivations have been forgotten. Constantine's Roman conspiracy succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but it also created problems that we're still dealing with today. The tension between religious authority and political power, the use of spiritual language to justify worldly actions, the difficulty of separating genuine belief from institutional loyalty. All of these issues trace back to the system that Constantine created in the 4th century. Whether you see this as a brilliant solution to an impossible problem or as a corruption of both Christianity and Roman governance probably depends on your own assumptions about the relationship between faith and politics. But either way, you have to admire the audacity of what Constantine accomplished. He took a dying empire and a persecuted religion and used them to create a new form of civilization that would dominate the Western world for over a millennium. The historical accident that created Christianity was actually a carefully calculated political strategy that succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And once you understand how it worked, you can never look at the relationship between religion and politics the same way again. The transformation didn't stop with Constantine's death in 337. In fact, that's when the real engineering began, because what Constantine had started was about to be tested by forces he never could have anticipated. His carefully constructed system would either prove its durability or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Within months of Constantine's death, the empire was divided among his 3 sons, and each one interpreted their father's Christian legacy differently. Constantine II controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Constantius II ruled the eastern provinces. Constans governed Italy, Africa, and the Balkans. But instead of continuing their father's delicate balancing act between Christian and traditional Roman interests, each son pushed the system in directions that revealed its underlying tensions. Constantius II, who controlled the wealthiest and most populous part of the empire, decided that his father hadn't gone far enough. He began actively persecuting traditional Roman religious practices, closing temples, confiscating religious artifacts, and banning sacrifices. This wasn't Constantine's subtle management of competing interests. This was outright religious warfare. But here's what's fascinating. Constantius wasn't motivated by deep Christian piety. He was using religious persecution as a tool to consolidate political power, eliminating potential sources of opposition while rewarding his Christian supporters. Meanwhile, the Christian church that Constantine had so carefully unified at Nicaea immediately fractured into competing factions. The Arian controversy, which Constantine thought he had settled, exploded into open conflict. Bishops who had signed the Nicene Creed under imperial pressure began questioning whether they had compromised their theological principles for political advantage. New theological disputes emerged over questions that hadn't even been discussed at Nicaea. The institutional unity that Constantine had created through political pressure proved to be incredibly fragile without his personal authority to maintain it. This is where you can see the true genius of Constantine's original strategy. He had never actually resolved the fundamental contradictions between Christian and Roman values. He had simply created a system that could manage those contradictions as long as everyone involved had incentives to cooperate. But when the political situation changed, when different emperors had different priorities, when Christian leaders felt secure enough to assert their independence, all the underlying tensions immediately resurfaced. The most revealing test came when Constantine's nephew Julian became emperor in 361. Julian had been raised in Constantine's court, educated by Christian tutors, and groomed for imperial service within the Christian system his uncle had created. But Julian had also been a careful observer of how that system actually worked. He had seen the financial incentives, the political appointments, the theological compromises, and the institutional manipulation that held Constantine's Christian empire together. When Julian became emperor, he didn't just reject Christianity, he systematically dismantled the entire Constantinian system. He removed Christian symbols from imperial regalia, ended financial support for Christian churches, dismissed Christian officials from government positions, and restored funding for traditional Roman temples and festivals. But most importantly, he exposed the political foundations of Constantine's religious revolution by demonstrating how quickly it could be reversed when imperial support was withdrawn. Julian's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of persecuting Christians directly, which would have created martyrs and strengthened Christian resolve, he simply removed the political advantages that Constantine had given them. Christian bishops, who had grown accustomed to imperial funding, suddenly found themselves dependent on voluntary donations from their communities. Christian officials who had enjoyed government positions discovered that their theological qualifications weren't valued in a traditional Roman administration. Christian institutions that had been integrated into imperial bureaucracy were suddenly irrelevant to the business of governing. The results were immediate and dramatic. Many Christians who had converted during Constantine's reign, attracted by the social and economic advantages of membership in the imperial religion, quietly abandoned their faith when those advantages disappeared. Christian communities that had grown comfortable with imperial support struggled to maintain their institutions through voluntary contributions. Christian leaders who had learned to operate within the Constantinian system found themselves unable to function effectively without imperial backing. But here's what's most significant about Julian's experiment. It failed, not because Christianity had become too deeply rooted in people's hearts, but because Constantine's institutional innovations had become too valuable to abandon. The administrative structures, communication networks, and organizational methods that Constantine had developed using Christian institutions had proven so effective that even a pagan emperor couldn't afford to eliminate them completely. Julian discovered that he could remove Christian theology from government, but he couldn't replace the practical functions that Christian institutions had come to serve. Christian bishops had become essential local administrators who understood their communities better than any imperial bureaucrat. Christian networks provided communication and coordination across vast distances more efficiently than traditional Roman systems. Christian institutions had developed methods for managing social welfare, education, and community organization that worked better than anything the traditional Roman system had produced. So Julian found himself in the impossible position of trying to restore pagan religion while maintaining the institutional structures that Constantine had built using Christian organization. He could change the symbols and the ceremonies, but he couldn't change the underlying reality that Constantine's system had created new forms of social organization that were superior to anything that had existed before. Julian's reign lasted less than 2 years before he died in a military campaign against Persia, but his experiment revealed the true nature of Constantine's achievement. Constantine hadn't just converted the Roman Empire to Christianity, he had used Christianity to solve fundamental problems of imperial governance that traditional Roman methods couldn't address. The institutional innovations he had developed were so effective that they survived even when the religious ideology that had inspired them was officially rejected. This is why Julian's successors, despite having no personal commitment to Christianity, immediately restored the Constantinian system. It wasn't because they believed in Christian doctrine, It was because they recognized that Constantine's institutional innovations were essential to effective governance. Jovian, who became emperor after Julian's death, reinstated Christian privileges within months of taking power. Valentinian and Valens, who divided the empire between them, both maintained the church-state partnership that Constantine had created, even though their personal religious commitments were questionable. The speed with which the Constantinian system was restored after Julian's death demonstrates that it had become functionally necessary rather than merely ideologically preferred. The administrative, economic, and social functions that Christian institutions performed had become so integral to imperial governance that removing them created immediate practical problems that no emperor could afford to ignore. But the restoration also revealed how much the system had changed during the brief period of Julian's rule. Christian leaders who had experienced life without imperial support developed a new understanding of their relationship to political power. They realized that the privileges Constantine had granted could be withdrawn just as easily as they had been bestowed. This recognition led to the development of more sophisticated theological justifications for Christian political authority, arguments that would make it much harder for future emperors to challenge the Church's role in governance. The most important of these developments was the emergence of the doctrine of divine right, the idea that Christian rulers derived their authority directly from God rather than from popular consent or institutional appointment. This doctrine, which would become central to medieval political theory, was essentially a theological response to Julian's demonstration that imperial support for Christianity was contingent and reversible. Christian theologians like Ambrose of Milan and John Chrysostom began arguing that emperors were accountable to God for their treatment of the Church, and that Christian bishops had the authority to judge whether imperial policies were consistent with divine will. This was a fundamental shift from Constantine's original system, where Christian leaders had been subordinate to imperial authority. Now, Christian leaders were claiming independent moral authority that could challenge imperial decisions. This theological development had immediate practical consequences. When Theodosius I became emperor in 379, he found himself dealing with Christian leaders who were much more assertive about their independence than Constantine's bishops had ever been. Ambrose of Milan famously forced Theodosius to do public penance for ordering a massacre in Thessalonica, demonstrating that Christian authority could now challenge imperial actions in ways that would have been unthinkable during Constantine's reign. But Theodosius was also smart enough to recognize that this development could serve his political interests if handled correctly. Instead of resisting Christian claims to moral authority, he embraced them, positioning himself as the most Christian of emperors and using religious orthodoxy as a tool for political legitimacy. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the official religion of the empire and declared that all subjects must accept the version of Christian doctrine endorsed by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria. This edict represents the completion of the process that Constantine had begun 70 years earlier. Christianity had evolved from a persecuted minority to a tolerated religion to the official ideology of the Roman state. But the Christianity that emerged from this process was fundamentally different from the Christianity that had existed before Constantine. It was more hierarchical, more institutionally sophisticated, more politically integrated, and more willing to use state power to enforce religious conformity. The transformation can be seen most clearly in how Christian leaders dealt with religious diversity within their own communities. Before Constantine, Christian communities had been forced to develop internal methods for resolving theological disputes because they had no access to external political authority. These methods emphasized persuasion, community consensus, and spiritual discernment, rather than institutional coercion. After Theodosius, Christian leaders had access to imperial power to enforce their theological decisions. Bishops who disagreed with official doctrine could be exiled, their supporters could be fined or imprisoned, and their writings could be confiscated and destroyed. The result was a much more uniform version of Christianity but also one that was maintained through political pressure rather than spiritual conviction. The Priscillian controversy in Spain provides a perfect example of how this system worked in practice. Priscillian was a Spanish bishop who taught a form of Christianity that emphasized personal spiritual experience and questioned some of the institutional developments that had occurred since Constantine's time. His teachings attracted a significant following among Spanish Christians, who felt that official Christianity had become too worldly and politically compromised. Under the pre-Constantinian system, this kind of theological dispute would have been resolved through debate, prayer, and community discernment. Different Christian communities might have reached different conclusions, but there would have been no mechanism for imposing a single solution on everyone. Under the post-Theodosian system, however, Priscillian's opponents could appeal to imperial authority to resolve the dispute in their favour. The result was that Priscillian and several of his supporters were executed in 385, becoming the first Christians to be killed by other Christians for theological reasons. This execution established a precedent that would be used for centuries to eliminate Christian leaders who challenged the institutional structures that Constantine had created. The spiritual authority that Christian leaders claimed over emperors was matched by the political authority that emperors could exercise over Christian dissidents. This development reveals the ultimate logic of Constantine's system. By integrating Christianity into the imperial power structure, he had created a situation where religious and political authority became mutually reinforcing. Christian leaders gained access to state power, but only as long as they supported the imperial system. Emperors gained religious legitimacy, but only as long as they maintained their partnership with Christian institutions. The system was incredibly effective at maintaining stability and order, but it came at the cost of the spiritual independence that had characterized early Christianity. The religion that emerged from this process was capable of surviving the collapse of the Roman Empire and creating the institutional foundations of European civilization, but it was also capable of justifying religious persecution, political oppression, and imperial expansion in the name of Christian orthodoxy. The barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries provided the ultimate test of Constantine's institutional innovations. When Germanic tribes began carving up the Western Roman Empire, they encountered Christian institutions that had been integrated into every aspect of Roman governance and society. These institutions didn't disappear when imperial authority collapsed. They adapted to serve new masters while maintaining their essential functions. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Frankish kingdoms in Gaul, all of them adopted the Constantinian model of church-state partnership because it provided exactly what barbarian rulers needed: a way to govern Roman populations using Roman administrative methods while claiming divine legitimacy for their authority. This is how Constantine's political innovation became the foundation of medieval European civilization. The feudal system that emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire was essentially a decentralized version of the Constantinian model, with local rulers claiming divine authority, while Christian institutions provided administrative expertise and ideological legitimacy. The long-term consequences extended far beyond Europe itself. When European powers began expanding globally in the 15th and 16th centuries, they carried the Constantinian model with them. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, the Portuguese colonization of Africa and Asia, the British expansion into India and Australia, all of these imperial projects used the same combination of political power and religious authority that Constantine had pioneered. Christian missionaries didn't just spread religious doctrines, they established the institutional frameworks that made European colonial governance possible. They created schools, hospitals, and administrative systems that served both spiritual and political purposes. They developed communication networks that allowed colonial authorities to maintain control over vast territories with minimal military force. They provided the ideological justification for European domination over non-European peoples. This global expansion of the Constantinian model had profound consequences for how Christianity itself developed as a world religion. The version of Christianity that spread through European colonialism was inevitably shaped by its integration with imperial power structures. It emphasized hierarchy, institutional authority, and cultural conformity rather than the spiritual egalitarianism and cultural diversity that had characterized earlier forms of Christianity. The Protestant Reformation can be understood as an attempt to reverse some of these developments by returning to pre-Constantinian forms of Christian authority. When Martin Luther challenged papal supremacy, he was essentially arguing that the institutional structures Constantine had created had corrupted Christianity's original message. But ironically, the Protestant princes who supported Luther used the same Constantinian logic to justify their rebellion, claiming divine authority for their political actions and using religious reform to strengthen their secular power. The religious wars that followed the Reformation demonstrated both the power and the danger of the Constantinian legacy. When religious and political authority became intertwined, religious differences automatically became political threats that had to be eliminated through force. The devastating conflicts that ravaged Europe for over a century were the inevitable result of a system that had made religious orthodoxy essential to political legitimacy. The eventual resolution of these conflicts through the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 represented a partial retreat from the Constantinian model. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio allowed rulers to determine the religion of their territories, but it also established the idea that political sovereignty could exist independently of religious authority. This was the beginning of the modern system of nation-states that would eventually replace the medieval synthesis of religious and political power. The American experiment in religious liberty represents one of the most significant challenges to the Constantinian legacy in modern history. The First Amendment's prohibition on religious establishment was explicitly designed to prevent the kind of church-state partnership that Constantine had created. The founders recognized that the integration of religious and political authority had been a source of conflict and oppression throughout Europe history, and they sought to create a system where both could coexist without either dominating the other. But even American separation of church and state hasn't completely escaped the Constantinian pattern. American civil religion, with its appeals to divine providence and its assumption that political institutions serve moral purposes, still reflects the basic premise that legitimate government requires religious legitimacy. The difference is that American civil religion draws from multiple religious traditions rather than privileging a single institutional church. Understanding Constantine's true legacy helps explain many of the tensions that continue to shape modern politics and religion. The ongoing debates about the role of religion in public life, the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority, the use of religious language to justify political actions, all of these issues trace back to the system that Constantine created in the 4th century. The evidence suggests that these tensions are not accidental byproducts of Constantine's policies, but inevitable consequences of any attempt to integrate religious and political authority. When spiritual claims are used to justify worldly power, both religion and politics become corrupted in ways that are difficult to reverse. When institutional loyalty becomes a test of religious orthodoxy, genuine spiritual seeking becomes subordinated to political calculation. This doesn't mean that Constantine's achievement should be dismissed or condemned. He faced genuine problems that required creative solutions, and the institutional innovations he developed were remarkably effective at achieving their intended purposes. The system he created preserved both Christianity and classical civilization through one of the most turbulent periods in human history, and it provided the foundation for cultural and intellectual achievements that continue to influence us today. But it does mean that we need to understand the costs as well as the benefits of Constantine's legacy. The Christianity that emerged from his system was capable of great institutional achievements. but it was also capable of great institutional abuses. The political structures he created were effective at maintaining order and stability, but they were also effective at suppressing dissent and enforcing conformity. The historical accident that created modern Christianity wasn't really an accident. It was the result of one man's recognition that religious and political authority could be combined in ways that served both spiritual and worldly purposes. Constantine's genius lay in seeing that opportunity and having the skill to exploit it without destroying either the religious or political elements that made it possible. Whether you see this as a brilliant solution to an impossible problem or as a fundamental corruption of both Christianity and Roman governance depends largely on your assumptions about the proper relationship between faith and power. But either way, the system Constantine created continues to shape how we think about religion, politics, and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. The conspiracy succeeded beyond Constantine's wildest imagination, creating a form of civilization that would dominate the Western world for over 15 centuries. But it also created problems and contradictions that we're still struggling to resolve today. Understanding how it all began is essential to understanding where we might go from here. The question of whether Constantine's deathbed baptism represents genuine conversion or final political calculation reveals perhaps the most telling aspect of his entire reign. Here was an emperor who had spent 25 years positioning himself as Christianity's great protector, who had convened the Council of Nicaea to establish Christian orthodoxy, who had built churches across the empire and granted unprecedented privileges to Christian leaders. And yet he waited until he was literally dying to undergo the most basic Christian ritual. Even more revealing is who performed the baptism. Constantine wasn't baptized by one of the Orthodox bishops who had supported him at Nicaea, or by the Pope in Rome, or by any of the mainstream Christian leaders who had benefited from his patronage. Instead, he was baptized by Eusebius of Nicaea, an Arian bishop whose theological position had been officially condemned at the very council Constantine had organized. This choice wasn't accidental. Eusebius of Nicaea was Constantine's political ally, a bishop who understood that theology served politics rather than the other way around. By choosing an Arian to perform his baptism, Constantine was sending a final message about the true nature of his relationship with Christianity. Even in death, he was demonstrating that his religious choices were guided by political considerations rather than theological convictions. The timing of the baptism also reveals Constantine's sophisticated understanding of Christian the 4th century, many doctrine and imperial politics. Christians believed that baptism washed away all previous sins, creating a clean slate for the afterlife. By waiting until his deathbed, Constantine could theoretically gain the spiritual benefits of Christianity without having to live by its moral constraints during his years of political power. This wasn't unusual among Roman emperors of the period. Delaying baptism until death became a common practice among rulers who wanted to maintain their flexibility during life, while still securing their eternal salvation. But Constantine's case is particularly striking because of the contrast between his public Christian persona and his private imperial behavior. Consider what Constantine did during his supposedly Christian reign. He executed his own son and wife in 326, just 1 year after presiding over the Council of Nicaea. He continued to use torture and execution as standard tools of imperial justice. He maintained the gladiatorial games and other forms of public entertainment that early Christians had condemned as barbaric. He fought wars of conquest and expansion that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. None of this behavior aligns with the Christian principles of forgiveness, mercy, and peace that he was supposedly promoting, but it aligns perfectly with the behavior of a Roman emperor who understood that maintaining power required ruthless pragmatism regardless of religious ideology. Constantine's genius lay in recognizing that he could adopt Christian symbols and rhetoric while continuing to exercise imperial authority according to traditional Roman methods. The institutional structures he created allowed him to present himself as serving God while actually serving his own political interests. The financial records from Constantine's reign provide another window into his true priorities. While he did provide funding for Christian churches and institutions, the amounts were relatively modest compared to his spending on military campaigns, public works projects, and imperial ceremonies. He built the new capital at Constantinople at enormous expense. But the Christian churches there were just one element in a broader program of imperial self-promotion that included temples, monuments, and artistic programs celebrating his personal achievements. Even more telling is how Constantine's financial support for Christianity was structured. Rather than providing unconditional grants, he created a system where Christian institutions received funding based on their loyalty to imperial policies and their willingness to serve government functions. Bishops who supported Constantine's political agenda received generous subsidies, while those who maintained independence or criticized imperial actions found their funding reduced or eliminated. This wasn't charity or religious devotion. It was a sophisticated system of political control that used financial incentives to ensure that Christian leadership remained subordinate to imperial authority. The bishops who benefited from this system understood exactly what was expected of them, and they delivered the political support that Constantine needed in exchange for the material benefits he provided. The architectural evidence from Constantine's reign tells a similar story. The churches he built were designed not just as places of worship, but as monuments to imperial power that happened to use Christian symbolism. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, for example, was constructed using architectural methods and decorative programs that deliberately echoed imperial palaces and triumphal monuments. Visitors were meant to be impressed not just by the sacred significance of the site, but by the wealth and power of the emperor who had built such a magnificent structure. The same pattern appears in other Constantinian churches throughout the empire. They were grand, expensive, and visually impressive, but they were also designed to reinforce messages about imperial authority and political hierarchy. The arrangement of spaces, the placement of images, and the organization of ceremonies all served to remind worshippers that their Christian emperor was responsible for their spiritual as well as their material welfare. This architectural program reveals Constantine's understanding of how religious spaces could be used to shape political consciousness. By creating churches that functioned as imperial monuments, he was teaching Christians to associate their faith with loyalty to his regime. By designing worship spaces that emphasized hierarchy and authority, he was preparing Christian communities to accept the institutional structures he was creating for the broader empire. The legal changes Constantine implemented provide another perspective on his strategic use of Christianity. While he did end the persecution of Christians and grant them legal protections, he also created new forms of religious regulation that served imperial interests. The laws he passed regarding Christian clergy, church property, and religious practices weren't just protective measures. They were tools for controlling how Christianity developed as a social and political force. For example, Constantine granted Christian bishops the authority to serve as judges in civil disputes, but only for cases involving other Christians, and only for matters that didn't conflict with imperial law. This gave Christian leaders a stake in the existing legal system, while ensuring that their authority remained subordinate to imperial courts. It was a brilliant way to co-opt potential opposition, while maintaining ultimate control over the administration of justice. Similarly, Constantine's laws regarding church property created a system where Christian institutions could accumulate wealth and influence, but only within limits established by imperial policy. Churches could own land, collect donations, and engage in economic activities, but they couldn't challenge the fundamental structure of Roman property law or taxation policy. They were allowed to prosper as long as their prosperity served imperial interests. These legal innovations reveal Constantine's sophisticated understanding of how institutional authority actually works, rather than trying to control Christianity through direct suppression, which had failed for his predecessors. he created a framework where Christian leaders had incentives to police themselves and their communities according to standards that served imperial purposes. The diplomatic correspondence from Constantine's reign shows how he used his Christian identity as a tool of foreign policy. His letters to other rulers consistently emphasized his role as protector of Christians throughout the known world, positioning himself as the leader of a transnational religious community that transcended political boundaries. This wasn't just religious rhetoric, it was a claim to political authority that extended beyond the traditional limits of Roman imperial power. When Constantine wrote to the Persian Emperor Shapur II, urging protection for Christians in the Persian Empire, he was essentially asserting that his authority as a Christian emperor gave him the right to intervene in the internal affairs of foreign kingdoms. This was a revolutionary expansion of imperial claims that used religious language to justify political ambitions that would have been unthinkable under traditional Roman diplomatic theory. The Persian response was immediate and predictable. Shapur recognized that Constantine's protection of Christians was actually a form of political interference and began persecuting Christians in his territory as potential agents of Roman influence. This demonstrates how Constantine's religious policies had immediate geopolitical consequences that extended far beyond the Roman Empire itself. But Constantine continued to use Christian networks for intelligence gathering and political influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Christian merchants, missionaries, and pilgrims provided information about conditions in foreign territories, while also spreading propaganda about the benefits of living under a Christian emperor. This was one of the first systematic uses of religious identity as a tool of soft power projection. The transformation of Christian institutions during Constantine's reign reveals how quickly religious organizations can adapt to political opportunities when the incentives are properly aligned. Before 312, Christian churches had been forced to operate as underground networks that emphasized secrecy, mutual support, and resistance to worldly authority. After Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge, these same institutions rapidly evolved into sophisticated bureaucracies capable of managing vast resources and coordinating complex administrative tasks. This transformation didn't happen gradually over generations. It occurred within a single decade as Christian leaders recognized the opportunities that Constantine's patronage created and moved quickly to take advantage of them. Bishops who had been hiding from persecution in 311 were serving as imperial advisors by 320. Churches that had been meeting in private homes in 312 were constructing massive public buildings by 325. Christian communities that had been focused on spiritual preparation for the end times suddenly found themselves managing earthly responsibilities that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The speed of this transformation reveals how adaptable religious institutions can be when political circumstances change. But it also raises questions about continuity and authenticity that Constantine's critics recognized even at the time. Were these still the same Christian communities that had maintained their faith through centuries of persecution? Or had they become something fundamentally different in response to imperial patronage? The answer appears to be both. The institutional structures and leadership networks that had allowed Christianity to survive Roman persecution provided the foundation for its rapid expansion under Constantine. But the goals, methods, and priorities of Christian institutions changed dramatically once they gained access to imperial resources and authority. What remained constant was organizational capability. What changed was how that capability was deployed. This pattern of institutional adaptation would be repeated throughout history, whenever religious movements gained political power. The same organizational skills that allowed religious communities to survive as minorities became tools for exercising authority over majorities once political circumstances changed. Constantine's innovation was recognizing this potential and creating conditions where it could be fully realized. The educational policies Constantine implemented reveal another dimension of his strategy for reshaping Roman civilization using Christian institutions. Rather than simply replacing pagan schools with Christian ones, he created a hybrid system that maintained classical learning while infusing it with Christian values and imperial ideology. This wasn't just about religious indoctrination, it was about creating a new form of cultural synthesis that could unite diverse populations under a common framework of ideas and values. The result was a transformation in how knowledge was organized, transmitted, and used for social purposes. Classical philosophy, literature, and science weren't abandoned, but they were reinterpreted through Christian theological frameworks that emphasized their compatibility with imperial authority. Christian schools didn't just teach religious doctrine, they taught students how to navigate the complex institutional relationships that Constantine had created between church and state. This educational synthesis became one of the most enduring aspects of Constantine's legacy. The curriculum and pedagogical methods developed during his reign provided the foundation for medieval European education, which in turn influenced Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment rationalism, and modern academic disciplines. Even secular universities today reflect organizational principles and intellectual assumptions that trace back to the educational innovations Constantine pioneered. The economic policies Constantine implemented using Christian institutions reveal his understanding of how religious authority could be used to manage social and economic relationships that traditional Roman methods couldn't address effectively. Christian churches became centers for managing charitable activities, but they also became nodes in networks for credit, trade, and economic coordination that operated according to different principles than purely commercial relationships. Christian concepts like just price, prohibition of usury, and obligation to care for the poor weren't just moral teachings, they were economic regulations that created alternatives to market mechanisms when those mechanisms produce socially unacceptable outcomes. Constantine recognized that these Christian economic principles could be used to maintain social stability and political loyalty in ways that traditional Roman methods couldn't achieve. The result was the development of what might be called a moral economy that complemented rather than replaced market relationships. Christian institutions provided safety nets for the poor, mediation services for commercial disputes, and alternative forms of economic organization that could function when market relationships broke down. This wasn't socialism or collectivism. It was a sophisticated form of mixed economy that used religious authority to regulate and supplement commercial activity. This economic innovation became another lasting element of Constantine's legacy. Medieval European economic systems, early modern colonial economies, and even some aspects of modern welfare states reflect principles and institutional arrangements that originated in Constantine's integration of Christian moral authority with imperial economic policy. The military implications of Constantine's religious policies reveal perhaps the most cynical aspect of his entire project. The Chi symbol that supposedly appeared in his vision wasn't just adopted as a personal emblem, it became a standard military insignia used on shields, banners, and equipment throughout the Roman army. This wasn't just religious symbolism, it was psychological warfare designed to convince both Roman soldiers and their enemies that Constantine's forces had divine support. The effectiveness of this innovation was immediate and obvious. Roman soldiers who fought under Christian symbols reported higher morale and greater confidence in battle. Enemy forces facing armies that claimed divine backing often experienced psychological pressure that affected their combat performance. Within a few years, the Chi had become one of the most feared symbols in the ancient world, not because of its religious significance, but because of its association with military success. Constantine's successors continued and expanded this use of Christian symbolism for military purposes. Imperial armies carried religious banners, priests blessed weapons and equipment, and military campaigns were presented as religious crusades against paganism, heresy, or barbarism. This militarization of Christianity became one of its most characteristic features during the medieval period and beyond. The irony is obvious. A religion that had originally taught pacifism and rejection of worldly power became one of history's most effective tools for justifying and organizing military violence. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was the logical result of Constantine's decision to integrate Christian institutions into the imperial war machine. Once religious authority became associated with military success, it became almost impossible to separate spiritual claims from political force. The cultural implications of Constantine's policies reveal how thoroughly he understood that lasting political change requires transformation of consciousness as well as institutions. The artistic, literary, and intellectual programs he sponsored weren't just decorative additions to his political project. They were essential tools for reshaping how people understood reality itself. The fusion of Christian and classical imagery that characterizes Constantinian art wasn't just aesthetic experimentation. It was visual propaganda designed to teach viewers that Christian and Roman values were compatible and mutually reinforcing. The historical narratives that emerged during his reign weren't just chronicles of events. They were carefully constructed interpretations that presented Constantine's rise to power as part of God's plan for human salvation. Even the calendar reforms Constantine implemented had cultural and political significance that went far beyond practical convenience. By establishing Sunday as a day of rest and creating new Christian holidays that coincided with traditional Roman festivals, he was gradually reshaping how people experience time itself. The rhythm of work and leisure, the cycle of seasons and celebrations, the marking of significant events, all of these temporal frameworks were adjusted to reinforce the cultural synthesis he was creating. This cultural engineering became one of the most successful aspects of Constantine's entire project. Long after the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the cultural patterns he had established continued to shape European consciousness. Medieval art, literature, philosophy, and even popular culture reflect assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority that originated in Constantine's 4th century innovations. The international ramifications of Constantine's religious policies extended far beyond the immediate borders of the Roman Empire and continued to influence global politics for centuries after his death. By positioning himself as the protector of Christians everywhere, Constantine had created a precedent for religious intervention in foreign affairs that would be used by his successors and imitators throughout history. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Eastern Roman provinces continued Constantine's policy of using Christian identity as a tool of diplomatic and military expansion. The Crusades were essentially an extension of Constantine's logic, applied to the recovery of Christian holy sites from Muslim control. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was justified using arguments that traced directly back to Constantine's claim that Christian emperors had divine authority to spread their faith through political and military means. Even modern conflicts reflect patterns that Constantine established. The use of religious language to justify political actions, the appeal to divine authority to legitimize military intervention, the claim that spreading democracy or human rights is a sacred mission, all of these contemporary phenomena echo the rhetorical and ideological strategies that Constantine pioneered. The institutional legacy of Constantine's innovations extends into virtually every aspect of modern Western civilization. The concept of separation of powers, the idea of constitutional government, the principle of individual rights, even the structure of modern bureaucracies. All of these political innovations developed in response to problems created by Constantine's integration of religious and political authority. The Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the development of modern democracy, the emergence of secular humanism, these weren't just intellectual movements. They were practical responses to the institutional arrangements that Constantine had created. Each represented an attempt to solve problems of authority, legitimacy, and governance that originated in the 4th century synthesis of Christianity and Roman imperial power. Understanding Constantine's true achievement helps explain why these later developments took the forms they did and why they faced the opposition they encountered. Every attempt to limit religious authority threatened institutional arrangements that had been fundamental to European civilization for over a millennium. Every effort to create secular alternatives to religious legitimacy had to overcome cultural assumptions that trace back to Constantine's original synthesis. So there you have it. The accident that created Christianity wasn't an accident at all. It was the most successful political conspiracy in human history, executed by a Roman emperor who understood that controlling people's beliefs was far more powerful than controlling their bodies. Constantine didn't just convert to Christianity, he converted Christianity itself into a tool of imperial control that would reshape the world for the next 2,000 years. Every time you see religious and political authority intertwined, every time you hear leaders claim divine sanction for earthly power, every time institutions use spiritual language to justify worldly actions, you're witnessing the echoes of Constantine's 4th century innovation. The system he created didn't just survive the fall of Rome, it became the blueprint for Western civilization itself. Whether you see this as political genius or spiritual corruption probably depends on where you stand today. But one thing is certain. Once you understand how it really happened, you can never look at the relationship between faith and power the same way again.